A president, a comedian, and a survivor. Ukraine votes for a new leader. Whoever wins inherits a conflict in the east, an ailing economy, and a tense standoff with Russia over Crimea. So, who will Ukrainians choose to lead them through the next 5 years? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Divya Gopalan. Now, Ukrainians are voting for a new president. 39 people are running as candidates, but many see a choice between three main candidates. There's the president, Petro Poroshenko, who's hoping to get another 5-year term. He's seen the conflict with the separatists in the east of the country grind on despite a ceasefire agreement. He's failed to reverse Russia's annexation of Crimea, and he's also been blamed for the corruption that persists. The survivor is Yulia Tymoshenko, a former prime minister whose spectacular fall from grace led her to a prison sentence. Then there's the comedian Volodymyr Zelensky. He's an actor with no political experience, but he does play the president on a popular TV series. Jonah Hull has this report.
This is the unexpected frontrunner in the race to become Ukraine's next president. Volodymyr Zelensky is an actor and comedian. His campaign appearances are stand-up comedy acts. What he lacks in actual policy or political experience, he makes up for with his on-screen persona in a popular television series. He's a teacher who blows the whistle on corruption, suddenly finding himself, yes, president of Ukraine.
Why is he so popular, Volodymyr Zelensky? Well, he's famous for one thing. Young people see him as an anti-establishment outsider figure, which they like. And he's funny, apparently.
I like him as a personality, but it seems even he isn't sure if he can be president or not. We don't know either. We just want to believe that he's a better option. Previous presidents were businessmen, politicians and liars. Maybe a comedian can make a difference for Ukraine.
Many feel that political unknown Zelensky could hardly do worse than the current president, Petro Poroshenko. He came to power after Russia's annexation of Crimea, vowing to end the war in the east and sweep away corruption. The billionaire confectionery king, here immortalized in bullet casings and his own sweet and chocolate wrappers, has bowed to pressure from the International Monetary Fund, raising utility prices that hurt the poor, and his inner circle is implicated in allegedly corrupt weapons purchases.
If we see corruption, I think we should talk about this. That's why reason of this painting, this is a conversation with President Poroshenko, first of all. And if he will be elected for the second time, I hope that it will make him to think about what kind of place in the history he wants to get.
Also in the running, after 2 decades in politics and 3 years in prison, is former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko. Many of her supporters at a final rally in central Kiev were bussed in from the countryside, drawn by a pledge to halve consumer gas prices. The focus of this election is the economy, with few promises being made about the war.
That's the toxic question for all the candidates. No one has answer, no one has vision, and no one wants to take responsibility.
5 years of war after a people's rebellion against Russian influence and corruption, and Ukraine is a country that seems stuck, unsure now which way to turn. Jonah Hull in Kiev for Inside Story.
And we can bring in our panel. Joining us from Kiev on Skype is Alexei Haran. He's a professor of comparative politics at Kiev Mohyla Academy in Moscow. We have Dmitry Babich, political analyst at Rossiya Sigonya news agency. And in London, Lilit Gevorgin, Russian and Eastern Europe analyst at IHS Markit. Welcome you, all of you. Welcome to the program. Great to have you on. There's going to be a very interesting and quite a dynamic discussion, I hope. Let me start with you, Mr. Haran. We have quite a varied field of candidates running in this election, and particularly our top three that we've outlined, or our correspondent Jonah Hull outlined just now. What would you say is the main issue that is driving the voters or that will influence how they choose their president?
Well, I can definitely tell about that. But it seems to me, first of all, when we're talking about presidential elections in Ukraine, we need to understand that we are not a presidential republic. It's a mixed system. And after presidential elections, we will have parliamentary elections. So we will have probably a coalition government with a prime minister, and president is to coexist with the prime minister. In this sense, a president cannot monopolize power in Ukraine as it happens in Belarus or in Russia or in some other countries. So presidential elections are definitely important, but then we are to wait for the results of parliamentary elections to see what final configuration of political power we'll have in place. Second, I would like to stress that in Ukraine, elections are always democratic, so it's very difficult to predict who will win. My third point, and everything depends on the vote of electors, of the opinion of Ukrainian people. And finally, I would say that in this campaign, the openly pro-Russian candidate has very low chances. So all the main three candidates, they are in favor of Europe or moving closer to Europe. If we are analyzing these three main candidates, so for President Poroshenko, the main success is that Ukraine survived. Ukraine survived after 2014 when direct Russian aggression started. It started with annexation of Crimea, then with economic blockade.
Okay, Mr. Haran, I'm going to interrupt you there. I just wanted to quickly talk about the issue that is driving the voters. We will go into the nitty-gritty of these elections and speak about individual candidates. Yeah, if you could keep it brief, because I'd like to get everyone's view first, and then we can...
If you would like to generalize, so three main topics: war and peace. The second topic is socio-economic situation, and the third topic is fighting corruption.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. We will now move on to Mr. Babic. Can you tell us how Moscow views these elections, and do they have any preference on which direction it would go?
Well, with Moscow, the problem is that a whole spectrum of political thought and political life in Ukraine that used to be sympathetic towards Russia, you know, the Party of Regions, the Communist Party, all of these political groups were basically banned after the so-called revolution of Maidan in 2014. So right now, there is no candidate that would be absolutely acceptable, that would be friendly towards Russia during this election. All three main candidates that were just mentioned, they all proclaimed their intention to move Ukraine towards NATO. And Russia said very clearly a few years ago that this is a red line. Russia will not allow Ukraine to join NATO because that would mean NATO missiles will be at a 3 or 2 minute distance from Moscow. This is something that Russia views as a red line. As for the issues of this election, I think the most important issue is war and peace. But I don't think it's going to be decided at this election because Mr. Poroshenko and his friends in the Ukrainian parliament, basically, they introduced the so-called deoccupation law, which proclaims Russia an aggressor and which makes it very difficult to fulfill the Minsk agreements on peace in the east of Ukraine, because the Minsk agreements presupposed amnesty for the rebels and a special status for the Russian-speaking territories in the east of Ukraine. None of that is possible under this new Ukrainian law. And of course, none of that is possible under the changes to the constitution that make Ukraine oriented towards NATO. And the second issue is economy. Here, I think the legacy of Mr. Poroshenko is just tragic because Ukraine was promised prosperity and the Europeanization in 2014. The result is that now Ukraine is officially the poorest nation in Europe. It went even further down, the scale of the poorest nations in Europe after Mr. Poroshenko introduced his so-called reforms with his so-called young reformers, most of whom cracked up to be corrupt. So I agree with Alexei, corruption is a very important issue, but unfortunately, the situation with corruption in Ukraine only worsened after Viktor Yanukovych was violently ousted from power by the Maidan revolutionaries.
Okay, thanks for that. Let me move on to Ms. Gevorgyan first. Can we talk about the view from Europe? And does Europe have any, or will whoever win have any influence on how Europe interacts with Ukraine?
From the European or Western perspective, it is very important that the new Ukrainian authorities, both the president and newly elected parliament, which is anticipated to take place by the end of this year, to remain on the Euro-Atlantic integration path. Economically speaking, this means Ukraine adhering to the IMF reform roadmap. Regardless the populist rhetoric, regardless the pledges of halving household gas price tariffs, there's simply no way that Ukraine could deal with its challenges, economic challenges, by turning its back on that reform path. It's simply not feasible at this stage. So from the European perspective, to ensure political stability and economic stability, it is important effectively to keep the status quo at worst, but at best they're hoping for a candidate who will also deal with the corruption issues.
Indeed, and that's certainly something I want to look into a little later in this program, including the economy. But let's talk about the candidates specifically, Mr. Haran. We have two veteran candidates and a comedian who has no defined policies, no experience, and yet is very popular. What kind of a message does that send? And why is that?
Yes, first of all, I am now in a very difficult situation because I think I need to react to what Russian colleague said, who is representing Russia today, which is Kremlin propaganda. And Russia is aggressor. Russia is waging war against Ukraine. Russia annexed Crimea. Russia is not electoral democracy, which is to teach others about democratic rules of the games and how to conduct elections. So first of all, I would like to stress that we have free elections and there are different candidates, including pro-Russian candidates. But the problem with pro-Russian candidates is that because of Russian aggression, because Russia violated non-bloc status of Ukraine, because Russia violated all international treaties and bilateral treaties, that's why the support towards orientation to Russia collapsed, totally collapsed. And that's why there is a very deep geopolitical move in the Ukrainian society towards Europe. And if we are talking about the war in the Donbass, so it's very important to understand that unfortunately Russia doesn't stick to point number one in the Minsk agreement, ceasefire. Ukrainian civilians are shelled. They are shelled by Russian soldiers, by Russian regular forces, by Russian weapons, and unfortunately it's very difficult to move to the peace in the Donbass when Russia is an active part of this conflict, not an intermediary, but an active part. If we are talking about three main candidates, as I have said, for Poroshenko, the main topic is to present that he is a leader who led the country towards economic difficulties and towards the war, and who is able to move forward in this difficult situation. For Tymoshenko, the main rhetoric is opposition rhetoric. So she is criticizing Poroshenko for not doing things in socio-economic spheres, in reform spheres. Sometimes this is populist criticism, sometimes it's justified, but this opposition niche is very, for her, is very natural and actually comfortable. But the other part of the Ukrainian electorate, they see that Ukraine is moving, but not at the tempo they wanted to see after the revolution of 2014. And that's why they would like to find new faces. And they pointed out to Mr. Zelensky, who to some is a new face. And as you rightly mentioned, he is really a new face with totally no experience in political life. So that's the basic background for these three main candidates.
Mr. Babic, I must let you respond. But before that, I want to set you up by asking you, is there a single candidate there that of the three that you see will be able to engage with Russia effectively?
Well, I won't tell you what I think about Alexei and his opinions, because I think this is very important during a debate to presume that the integrity of your opponent, to argue with his or her arguments, not with his or her place of work or anything. So I will go straightly to your question. I would say that until recently, it looked like the West was totally supportive of Poroshenko. You know, when Poroshenko imposed a martial law on half of Ukraine's regions just 5 months before the election, and this martial law continued for several weeks, the West didn't protest. So the mere idea that Mr. Zelensky could win this vote, it surfaced just a few weeks ago. Suddenly, the tone of Western publications about Zelensky became very positive. Some business outsiders who were members of the government in the early years of Poroshenko, all of these foreign specialists from Lithuania, from McKinsey and Company, you know, Mr. Daniliuk, the former finance minister, Mr. Abramovičius, a Lithuanian, a former economics minister. Suddenly they joined Mr. Zelensky's team, and Mr. Zelensky has got some chances. We have seen the United States actually giving a blessing to his candidacy when Zelensky met with the U.S. negotiator on the civil war in Ukraine. When he met Mr. Volker, you know, Kurt Volker, the U.S. negotiator on Ukraine, and when he met the Ukrainian ambassador, the American ambassador in Ukraine, Mary Jovanovic, it meant that the United States kind of endorsed his possible victory, you know, Mr. Zelensky's possible victory. For Russia, maybe it will be easier to talk to Mr. Zelensky because Mr. Zelensky is not ashamed to speak Russian in public. Please note that in your report that you showed right before our discussion, the Ukrainian citizens who were answering your reporter's question, you know, when they didn't speak English, they spoke Russian. You know, Russian is very widespread in Ukraine. So Mr. Poroshenko's language policy was a disaster. He antagonized a lot of people in Ukraine, and that was reflected in an article, for example, by Politico magazine, an American publication, which criticized Mr. Poroshenko for this kind of language policy. So for Russia, Zelensky could be just a new face that we could talk to. Also, probably Yuri Boyko, the fourth candidate, who is behind Mrs. Tymoshenko in the opinion polls, but since Ukraine is not a free country, I don't think we should believe all the opinion polls. He suddenly may become, you know, possibly even the second during the first round of the race. Boyko, unfortunately, participated. He basically betrayed former President Yanukovych in 2014. But Boyko, it's possible to talk to him. He visited Russia just recently. He had negotiations with the Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev on the gas issues, but immediately a criminal case was opened against Boyko in Ukraine when he returned from Moscow. So for any candidate, whoever wins this election, it will be very difficult to talk to Moscow, not because Russia is not ready to talk, but because in Ukraine there will be tremendous pressure from the nationalists and from the government agencies. They may accuse this president of being a traitor, being a stooge of Moscow. That's the problem.
Okay. Let me bring in Ms. Gevorgian. How important is it for Ukraine's survival or the economy itself, which has been languishing, to have closer relations with Russia, to move in, at least have workable relations with Russia?
If we were having this discussion back in 2014, I would have said that it is really important to ensure that Ukraine receives or negotiates cheaper Russian gas and maintains its access to the Russian market. However, since the Ukrainian crisis, Ukraine has done incredible steps actually to balance its economy. and also improve the energy efficiency. Just to give you an example, for many years, its state-run energy company, Naftogaz Ukraine, was a loss-making company. It was actually a burden on Ukrainian public finances. Ukrainians were paying only 1/5 of the gas, household gas price. It was heavily subsidized, really unsustainable measures that no government wanted to address because these were extremely unpopular steps. Equally, the currency was pegged unrealistically strong against the dollar. Again, no government, revolutionary or not, they didn't want to deal with these issues. They didn't want to let the currency float. Now, coming back to your question directly now, by going through the painful reforms that really had an impact on ordinary Ukrainians, long-term gains are such that Ukraine has managed to lessen its dependence on Russian energy imports. It has also managed to diversify its export market. For example, if in the past, a few years ago, Russia was accounting for 25% of its export destination, now it's only 9%. European Union is by far more important for Ukrainian exporters than Russia. Of course, having access to a large market next door is important, but it's not where where Ukraine's economic problems can be solved. Ukrainian economic problems can be solved domestically if the anti-corruption and anti-oligarchy campaign is in earnest done and the reorientation continues. I just want to highlight one aspect of these reforms. Whereas in politics, you can sometimes make quick U-turns. In the economic world, these adjustments can be painful and long-lasting, and sometimes the positive impact can come not in 5 years, but perhaps in 10 years. And this is why we see that perhaps some politicians are being punished at ballot boxes for the unpopular reforms that they had to do. They had no other choice.
Okay, Alexei Haran, so given all of what we've heard, how important is the Russia factor in these elections, and how important is the Crimea factor in these elections? Or are people just going for more issues that hit them at home, the economy, the price of fuel, corruption?
No, definitely people, again, as I have said, the war and peace and the war with Russia is one of the main topics in the campaign. And as I have already explained, I can give you a lot of polls which showed that the attitudes towards Russia totally changed after 2014. And there's no now belief that Russia is a strategic partner. There is a belief that Russia is aggressor, and Russia is aggressor after annexation Crimea and after the intervention in the Donbass. And there's no talk about civil war. That's what Kremlin propaganda talking about, civil war. This language is not accepted not only by Ukrainians, but also by international community. We know pretty well that Russia is under sanctions. Finally, I would like also to stress that it's fun to hear how representative of Russia, which has one man in power for 20 years and will have for 5 more, so a quarter of a century, they are teaching Ukraine a democracy. We are a free country, and this is recognized by the world. And elections in Ukraine were recognized as free and fair in 2014, and I'm pretty sure they will be recognized the same this year. The role of the West. The Western candidates, the Western representatives, they are meeting with main political leaders of the campaign. There's no surprise in that. It's not a blessing. I would say the West is not supporting openly any candidate in this campaign. Definitely the West and the investors, they would like to see predictability. And some candidates are more predictable and some candidates are less predictable.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. It's been good to speak to all of you. Great to get your thoughts, whatever the outcome. Interesting times ahead for Ukraine. I'd like to thank all of our guests, Alexei Haran, Dmitry Babich, and Lilith Gevorgyan. And thank you too for watching. You can see this program again anytime by visiting our website. That's on aljazeera.com. And for any further discussion, why don't you go to our Facebook page? You'll find that on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And remember, you can always join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle for that is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Divya Gopalan, and the whole team here, it's been good to have you here. Goodbye for now.